Over some years now, we at DAG have been breaking the shackles of what are considered gallery exhibitions, which shows that have penetrated deeper into our histories than any conventional art show.
Sit down.
Sure. Showing the intertwined representations in art that accrue when two civilizations or cultures meet or clash. Among these was an exhibition on Tipu Sultan that helped correct prejudiced Western perceptions. An exhibition I'm pleased to share that was inaugurated by Shashi Tharoor, whose insights offered a refreshing alternative to skewed colonial perspectives. I'm glad that with today's lecture by our esteemed guest, we are strengthening this relationship between words and art. Dr. Tharoor's views on the British Raj are well known through his books and previous lectures, including in London, where colonial history is unfortunately neglected as a subject. There are now increasing number of writers and historians addressing this gap, especially in India. At this evening salon, we have the opportunity to listen to Dr. Tharoor as he discusses something that continues to provoke opinions on both sides of this divide. Thank you, Shashi, for your gift of friendship to DAG, for being such a pillar of support with your ideas, interpretations, and it goes without saying, your scholarship. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Enjoy the evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anish, and really is a pleasure to be back at DAG, but for the first time in Mumbai. I'm a fairly frequent attendee at Anish's events in Delhi, and I'm pleased to say that I have spoken there at some of his exhibitions on some important subjects. This is a first glimpse of the DAG in Mumbai, and I'm delighted to see you all here. I think that Anish is right that most of you are already very familiar with my views on colonialism, and I wondered whether you really wanted me to inflict a speech on you, but if, since the organizers assure me that you do, I thought perhaps the most useful thing to do then is to try and take you briefly through the principal arguments as to why I think colonialism was an utter disaster for this country. Anish mentioned both points of view. I don't know what the other point of view is, because it certainly isn't one that I would give anything but short shrift to. And let me explain why. Now, I have to say that we have, for good reason, I think, chosen to forget a lot of the atrocities of the colonial period, other than the tragic Brexit of 1947 and the horrors of partition. But we still managed to remain rather free from bitterness, remain within the Commonwealth as a republic, maintain cordial relations with our former rulers. And as Jawaharlal Nehru famously told Winston Churchill, despite his 11 years in British jails, he said Mahatma Gandhi had taught Indians never to fear and never to hate. And that, I think, is ultimately one of the principal lessons that he imbibed from the great Mahatma. But at the same time, when I was provoked into a debate in the Oxford Union in 2015, and I sort of gave a somewhat impromptu assault on the citadels of the empire, I was astonished to realize that there perhaps was something unfamiliar about my arguments, because suddenly 3 million people had downloaded it within 24 hours, and it's been seen by millions since. And there was obviously a great deal of interest in arguments that I thought every Indian growing up in this country with a modicum of familiarity with history should be aware of. So since that wasn't the case then, which is what prompted my publishers to talk me into writing the book that's published in this country as An Era of Darkness and in the rest of the world as Inglorious Empire, I will say that I'm going to try and recap some of the principal arguments. Obviously, it's a smattering of what you will find in the book, but if you are interested, there's a lot more detail and, of course, extensively footnoted in the volumes themselves. I might add that the ruthless economic exploitation and the cultural dislocation caused by British colonialism have also left us with the language I'm using to address you today. But even that, I'm going to argue, was not a gift of the British, who had absolutely no desire to teach their language to the vast mass of Indians. They just wanted a small class of interpreters, as it were, to serve between them and the governed. And that's all they were really interested in. So there was very, very minimal education. It was Indians who seized upon the advantages the English language conferred to learn the language, to open far more educational institutions than the British ever did at their expense, and then to use the language as an instrument of nationalism as well. But that's another story. So let me start with the economics of loot. And loot is a particularly appropriate word because the English took the word into their dictionaries as well as their habits. It wasn't an English word till they came here and stole it. The fact is that the process of colonial rule did mean economic exploitation and ruin to millions, the destruction of thriving industries, the systematic denial of opportunities to compete, the elimination of indigenous institutions of governance, the transformations of entire livelihoods and lives and patterns of living that had flourished since time immemorial, and the obliteration of the most precious possession of the colonized, their self-respect. In 1600, when the East India Company was established, Britain was a tiny, rather impoverished country producing 1.8% of the world's GDP. India at that point was generating a little over 23%. It went up to 27% by 1700 of the world's GDP. In fact, the revenues of the last major Mughal emperor, Aurangzeb, as the Mughal emperor 100 years after the founding of the East India Company, were larger than all the crowned heads of Europe combined. That was how wealthy India was in comparison with the country that was to colonize it. And the fact is that by 1940, after 200 years of British rule, I won't say the Raj, because the Raj officially began only in 1857, but de facto had existed since about 1757. Britain accounted for over 10% of the world GDP, while India had been reduced to a poor third world country, a poster child for destitution, starvation, poverty, and famine. The British left us in 1947 as a society with 16% literacy, a life expectancy of just 27, practically no domestic industry, a 5-decade economic growth rate in the 20th century of below 0.1%. Can you imagine? We were growing by less than 0.1% a year for 50 years. And over 90% of the population living below what we would today call the poverty line. That was the great, munificent British Empire. Why was India the jewel in the crown? At the beginning, of course, as I said, we were an economy larger than all of Europe put together. But the essential element was that India was then governed for the benefit of Britain. And for 200 years, Britain's rise was financed by its depredations in India. India was treated as a cash cow. The revenues that flowed into London's treasury were described by the Earl of Chatham, the British Prime Minister William Pitt the Elder, as the redemption of a nation, a gift from heaven. That's what we were for the Brits, apparently. By the end of the 19th century, India was the world's biggest buyer of British goods. My apologies. And of course, we provided extremely highly paid work for British civil servants, all at India's expense. And there's a professor, Professor Utsa Patnaik, who published through Columbia University Press, obviously very high standards of academic review there, a comprehensive estimate of the value of British colonial extraction from India. Between 1765 and 1938, between the East India Company and the British Raj, they siphoned out 9.2 trillion pounds, equivalent at the historical rate of exchange at 4.8 per dollar, $4.8 per pound, to 45 trillion American dollars. Now, to put that in perspective, the total GDP of Britain today is 3 trillion, okay? So they essentially took out of India 15 times their annual GDP of today. Now, obviously, most of India's foreign exchange earnings went to Britain. We had no money of our own for whatever we sent out. We didn't have the means to import machinery or technology or modernize our economy, which non-colonized countries like even Thailand and Japan were able to do. You know, and our drain of resources from India was as high as 26 to 30% of the annual budget. So imagine every year the government of India's budget consists of paying almost a third of it to a foreign country. But that's what we did for 200 years. I mentioned that we had practically no increase in per capita income. We also had this happening at a time when the second largest export surpluses in the world for 3 decades before 1929 were coming out of India. I'm sorry. Was I inaudible at the back? Sorry. But in any case, those export surpluses were all sent off to London, and not a penny was allowed to be kept in India itself. When the East India Company first obtained revenue collecting rights in Bengal in 1765, it extortionately managed to treble the tax revenue within 5 years. The result, as you can imagine, was a massive famine in 1717 Bengal. And out of a population of 30 million in Bengal at that time, the British managed to wipe out 1/3. Can you imagine? The British themselves estimated that about 10 million people died in the famine they caused by extracting 3 times the amount of revenue that had ever historically been extracted from the poor peasantry of Bengal. That was just the beginning, by the way. As India became increasingly central to British prosperity, millions more died completely unnecessary deaths. Between about 35 and 39 million Indians died of starvation as a direct result of economic policies ruthlessly pursued and enforced by the British. It was and has been described by a British historian as a colonial holocaust. And of course, when the Brits were busy doing this, they were all simultaneously exporting millions of tons of Indian wheat at cheap prices to the bread baskets of London. When they set up relief camps finally, so from about 1770 all the way to about 1870, they just allowed people to die. In fact, the prevailing mantra at that time was that you must not give charity to the starving because that only encourages idleness. I kid you not, there's actually an incident I've recorded in my book of a poor, soft-hearted Scotsman, I think he was, who actually had a man starving to death at his doorstep and gave him some food. And the British said, you will be deported from here if you do this again. You cannot live in India and treat the natives in this way. That was the prevailing dogma at the time. But by the late 19th century, when I suppose the Enlightenment had dawned in Britain too, and the freedom of the press and world conscience and all of that, they felt some obligation to justify their presence on grounds other than mere loot and prosperity. They then talked about their missionary, civilizing mission to improve the lot of the benighted masses. And therefore, when the masses were being starved to death because of their policies, they had to set up relief camps to feed them. Again, the British historian Mike Davies has estimated that the food provided in these relief camps was less than Hitler gave the emaciated Jews in Buchenwald before sending them to the gas chambers. So you can imagine that large populations in the relief camps died as well. I mentioned that Britain's Industrial Revolution was built on the deindustrialization of India, the destruction of Indian textiles, their substitution by manufacturing in England, using Indian raw material exported for next for nothing, in fact, paid for basically by Indian taxes. So essentially, people who used to come and trade in Indian textiles are now getting them basically for free because they were extracting the revenue from Indians and then spending it buying Indian material. Then they manufactured it in the dark satanic mills of England and shipped them back to India and to the rest of the world, of course. And this resulted in the great deindustrialization of India with, for example, the world's first city to actually lose population because of the destruction of industry was Murshidabad in Bengal, which was the capital and was a major center of weaving and textiles. They lost population because the weavers had their looms broken. One account has their thumbs chopped off by the British. That's disputed by the British, but this was a Dutch account by an observer. And the weavers, unable to practice their craft, fled into the countryside, hoping to get some subsistence in their home villages, and that meant the depopulation of Murshidabad. Similarly with Dhaka. And this is in a culture which was famous around the world for 2,000 years for its export of fine muslins, light as woven air, it was said. There are records during the Roman Empire by Pliny the Elder recording debates in the Roman Senate of Romans decrying the fact that all the golden Rome was sitting in India because of the taste of Roman women for Indian fine textiles and muslins. And this is the place that was essentially shattered by the force of British arms. Muslin exports were ended through punitive duties and tariffs, while British goods flooded India because, of course, the British didn't charge any taxes or duties or tariffs, in today's favorite word, on their own produce. Dhaka, I mentioned, also lost population from several lakhs in 1760 to down to about 50,000 people by 1820, entirely because of this. And having been the world's most important exporter of finished goods, India now became an importer of British ones. Our share of world exports was 27%. When the British came, it fell to below 2% during British rule, while imports from Britain by force skyrocketed. And of course, we became then the classic colonial terms of trade, right? The colonies were sources of raw material, in our case, cotton, jute, coal, opium, rice, spices, and tea, rather than any manufactured products. So anyway, colonial extraction was enforced with varying degrees of brutality. The numbers and injustices committed are a matter of historical record, so I won't belabor the point, because the British themselves kept meticulous accounts of the wealth they drained from India annually. And while you can add all that up, as Professor Patnaik has done, how do you assign a monetary value to the 35 million people who died unnecessary deaths? How do you actually compute the value of a human life? And to my mind, when I debated reparations at the Oxford Union, I made the point that no credible amount is payable, and no payable amount would be credible. So why go down the route of financials? I said that, well, I'll come to that at the end of my remarks, but I said there's got to be a better way that I would summarize as atonement. Moral atonement is what we really seek from the British rather than money. But anyway, famines we've talked about, and that's awful. There were colonial massacres beyond famines. When the Jallianwala Bagh massacre happened, killing over 1389, I think the exact number is, innocent people in cold blood, unarmed people, gathered for a peaceful gathering on Baisakhi Day. You can compare that to the butchery of over 100,000 men, women, and children, mainly women and children, in Delhi in 1858 when they put down the so-called Sepoy Mutiny. And of course, if we're going to talk famine still, the Great Bengal Famine of 1943, 3.4 million lives. Crimes against humanity were committed in colonial rule. And what's absolutely horrific is that when that Great Bengal Famine was happening, it happened because Churchill was Prime Minister by then, deliberately ordered the diversion of food away from starving Indian civilians to well-supplied British soldiers and European stockpiles for the possible future invasion of Greece. So they were stocking up food for people who might need it if the British got around to invading Greece, which was under Nazi control at the time, rather than feeding people who were actually dying before the eyes of appalled British officials. And when he started getting protests from the somewhat more humane administrators in Calcutta. He wrote, "The starvation of anyway underfed Bengalis is less serious than that of sturdy Tommies." He added, "I hate Indians. They're a beastly people with a beastly religion." In any case, he said the famine was their fault for breeding like rabbits. When officers of conscience pointed out in a telegram the scale of the human tragedy unfolding as a direct result of his policies, Churchill's only response was to ask peevishly, "Why hasn't Gandhi died yet?" And this is the man whom the British want to hail as the great savior of democracy and human freedoms. I classify him in about the same category as Hitler, Stalin, and Mao Zedong amongst the great butchers of the 20th century. Anyway, Churchill's inhumane conduct in the summer and autumn of 1943 simply gave lie to the myth of British enlightened despotism, a myth that had been battered by 2 centuries of their own conduct. But the fact is that they'd always been pretty brutal. They put down rebellions by blowing rebels from the mouths of cannons. You can imagine what a grisly death that was. We have bits and pieces of human anatomy scattered far and wide, depending on the power of the cannon, torturing those who could not afford to pay their taxes. As early as the 1770s, during the impeachment of Warren Hastings, 1780s, the playwright Sheridan's wife was in the gallery of the House of Commons listening to the horrible stories of the torture of women and men who couldn't pay their taxes. And she swooned famously. Sheridan wrote how she fainted in horror at what the British were doing to these poor Indians. It went on for another 150 years after her fainting fits. It didn't do much very good. Meanwhile, of course, people like Robert Clive bought their rotten boroughs in England with the proceeds of their rapacity in India, all the while marveling publicly at his own self-restraint in not stealing even more than he had. And the British had the gall to call him Clive of India, as if he had belonged to the country, when all he really did was to ensure that much of the country belonged to him. Anyway, that's one set of arguments that I thought I should leave you with. I've belabored the point, so I won't expand it. Then you've got people saying, but you know, the British gave us the railways. Well, let me tell you a little bit about that, because the fact is there are an awful lot of countries that managed to build railways without going to the trouble and expense of being colonized to have to do it. And the truth is that the British actually left us with only a fraction of the railways we today have, because they weren't interested in connecting human beings through the railways. They, first of all, built the railways as a gigantic colonial scam. They had British shareholders making absurd amounts of money by investing in the railways. The government guaranteed returns on the Indian railways that are double the highest returns available on the London Stock Exchange, because any shortfall in revenues was made up for by the government out of Indian taxpayers' money. So the revenues came from Indian taxes, not British taxes. And when they built it, therefore, a mile of Indian railway supposedly cost double that of the same distance in the far more difficult terrain of Canada and Australia, where railways were being built at the same time. But in India, they charged more because the Indian taxpayer was paying for it. It was a splendid racket for everyone involved. It was described at the time as private profit at public risk, except that the private profit was all British and the public risk was all Indian. But anyway, the British made the money, controlled the railway technology, and supplied all the equipment, and of course repatriated all the profits to Britain. So the railways do not support the idea that British colonialism benefited India. Rather, they provide evidence, further evidence for the established argument that the British took far more out of the colony than they put into it. The railways were also principally intended to serve British interests, which is to transport extracted resources like coal, iron ore, cotton to ports, to send them off to Britain for British use. They had nothing to do with Indian interests. The movement of people was incidental and only when it served colonial interests. It was mainly to send troops into the country to put down any restive rebellions. No effort was made to ensure that supply for popular transport, for people wanting to move around, matched demand. Racism was also rampant. There are contemporary cartoons in the 19th century already showing overcrowded trains with people clinging to the sides and sitting on roofs, while white passengers sat comfortably in largely empty compartments. And one colonist said to the other, "My dear chap, there's nobody on this train." I mean, quite literally, there were a lot of bodies on the train, but they didn't happen to be white. But anyway, India survived that, and after independence, and by the way, in those days, India had the cheapest freight rates in the world of any railway, because the British were shipping their goods to ports with subsidized rates, and the most expensive passenger rates of any railway in the world, because it was Indians who were the bulk of the passengers. It was only after independence that India reversed that logic. Now, unfortunately, the railways are very expensive for freight and very cheap for travel, but that is now today serving a social purpose that didn't serve in those days under the British. And we now have built lines, railway lines, to actually connect human beings to each other rather than to extract goods and send them off for British benefit. The other argument that's often used is, oh, but the British gave us political unity. We were a bunch of warring kingdoms. Yes, when they came, we were a bunch of warring kingdoms, but there'd been political unity before, and there would have been after. Going back to Emperor Ashoka in the 3rd century BC, much of the subcontinent had been united. If you look at Adi Shankara's travels from Kerala to Kashmir and Dwarka to Puri in the 7th, 8th century AD, you can imagine that there was very much a sense of civilizational unity as well. And with modern transport and communications, this unity would have certainly ended up as political unity. In fact, when the British came, the Marathas were in the process of doing just that, conquering the whole country, reducing the Mughal emperor to a sort of constitutional monarch by essentially keeping him a prisoner in Red Fort and telling him what to sign, and parking their own sort of Peshwas and satraps in different parts, all the way down to Tanjore. I mean, sambar was invented in Tamil Nadu, in Tanjore, because of the taste of Sambhaji for dal. And he was a Maratha ruler, being parked in Tamil Nadu, and so they had to invent something that vaguely resembled the dal he was missing. They created sambar and named it for him, for Sambhaji. So, I mean, this is how the Marathas were also busy unifying India politically. But anyway, how can you give the British any credit for whatever political unity they did bring about when they actually left the country with the horrors of partition, with 1 million dead, 13 million displaced, billions of rupees of property destroyed in their hasty Brexit of 1947, all because of their policies of divide and rule, which are another subject altogether we don't have time for today. But divide and rule was about their desire to control the subcontinent by pitting artificially created groups against each other. And the map, the census, the museum were all instruments of political colonialism, and so too became religion. The other argument that's often used is, oh, but we have the English language. And I said I'll come back to that when I mentioned it at the beginning. Let me talk about that. Thomas Macaulay's notorious 1835 Minute on Indian Education laid the policy down very clearly. It wasn't about making all Indians speak a common language, far from it. It was to create, in his own words, a class of Indians, Indian in blood and color, but English in taste, opinions, morals, and intellect, in order to serve as intermediaries for the colonists with the people they were ruling or oppressing or exploiting, as whatever word you wish to use. And in the process, they erased a lot of indigenous knowledge and distorted Indian history, Indian culture, India's achievements in mathematics, astronomy, in Ayurveda, in wellness, and philosophy were completely trashed, marginalized, and discarded, whereas textbooks portrayed a British-centric, Eurocentric narrative glorifying the learning of the West and telling Indians they came from a backward society. Even the education imparted was an instrument of colonial domination. And what the British did to the Indian mind in the process is another subject altogether. But that was part very much of their efforts, because even language reinforced imperial power. Terms like native or tribe in Africa, caste in India, dehumanized colonized populations, and of course justified the so-called civilizing mission. There's a lot more one could say, but I'm very conscious of the advancing clock. And I will try and just reduce my argument to this. The British managed, with the little people they managed to reach, to produce a whole class of alienated Indian students unable to match their British counterparts, speaking what the British dismissed as Babu English, which is just good enough for lower level clerical jobs that could help British move their files and could communicate in a sort of local pidgin with their bosses, so the bosses knew what the hell the people they were ruling and bossing over were telling them. But as I said, general literacy they were not interested in. When the British left, it was 16% literacy, and don't forget that for every one educational institution the British established, rich Indians managed to establish 9. So in Calcutta, for example, the British set up presidency. Raja Ram Mohan Roy set up 9 other colleges. That was the kind of difference that Indians tried to make because they wanted the benefits of education. But it was this education, the syllabus, the curriculum, the biases were all British. And the traditions we had in pre-colonial India, gurukuls, people learning at the homes of pandits, educational institutions as well, like Nalanda and Vikramashila, local schooling systems where pathshalas taught everyone, and often more than one language, by the way. All of that was dismantled, and access to education under British rule at its peak reached just 4% of the population. So that's how cumulatively you got 16% literacy over all those years. Yes, some Indians seized English and used it as a language of resistance. Nehru discovered India. The discovery of India was written in English. But that was not the intent of the colonizers. The true legacy of colonial education was alienation, the dismantling of indigenous systems, and the embedding of English as a marker of status and authority. The British didn't just conquer territory, they also conquered your identity, your language, and ultimately your thought. So that is on that subject. If you want me to go through a few more arguments, they said that, oh, we've given India rule of law. Well, I'll dismiss that pretty quickly because rule of law meant white judges imposing white justice on brown people. If an Indian so much as raised his hand against an Englishman, he could be executed or shipped off for life to a distant colony. Singapore was built entirely by essentially slave labor of Indians penalized and shipped off to work on the colonies. The same applied to Malacca and to other places. And we had in India a situation where Englishmen killing Indians were let off because there was a very common practice of kicking Indians to death. And the British decided that this was because Indians had diseased spleens that they were dying from being kicked. That because they all were sort of malarial and otherwise feeble, their spleens ruptured when a healthy, hearty Englishman gave them a well-deserved kick. And therefore the death of an Indian did not occasion any punishment. And there are cases after cases. There's actually a German scholar whom I've documented with footnotes in my book, who studied case after case of this kind of thing. It was a widespread pattern. This is the rule of law. And of course, for the rest of it, of course, it imposed Victorian attitudes on India, a country that had the notion of the Ardhanarishwara and the whole question of the transvestite Shikhandin in the Mahabharata and so on, suddenly finding that homosexuality was illegal and something to be ashamed of, that transvestites were banished, as it were, to become a criminal tribe as hijras, and of course Section 377 of the Macaulay era penal code was imposed, all in pursuance of a British morality that had very little to do with Indian social reality, but then crippled India's social reality for another century. Law enforcement completely riddled with racism. I won't go into all of that, but doesn't surprise you, I'm sure. And the great irony of the British liking to say, well, we gave the Indians democracy. Well, it's all very well, as I said in the Oxford debate, to imprison, torture, exploit, extract, maim, and then otherwise destroy a people and then celebrate the fact that after 200 years of that, they're democratic at the end of it. We had to seize our democracy, S-E-I-Z-E, seize our democracy from the British, from the recalcitrant, unwilling British, literally inch by inch and centimeter by centimeter, as grudging reform after grudging reform came our way. And even in the last election of British rule, only 10% of adult Indians was able to vote. We had a population of about 330 million in undivided India in 1946. The entire electorate was 30 million. So the British never gave us democracy. We created it, and India chose to give itself, for example, free and universal adult franchise at a time when the British had not equipped Indians to meet their standards for having the franchise, namely literacy or property ownership. There's so much more one could say, but I think I really have run out of the time I promised. I will say that ultimately, the entrenching of colonialism also meant, for example, as I mentioned, the map, the museum, the census, the creation of communal identities. Even the solidification of caste has been demonstrated by scholars to be a colonial creation. All of these were relatively fluid identities in the past. Yes, there was horrendous caste discrimination. Yes, there was occasional interreligious violence, but it was never complete. Today, we talk about Shivaji as a great Hindu king fighting the horrible Muslim emperor. But half the Muslim emperor's generals fighting against Shivaji were Rajput Hindus. Half of the artillery captains in Shivaji's army were Muslims from Arabia, Turkey, Persia. This is not uncommon. If you think of the Maharana Pratap's great battle of Haldi Ghati, who was the general who actually fought? Maharana Pratap wasn't on the battlefield. I mean, the battlefield, the troops were led by a man called Hakim Khan Sur. And Akbar wasn't fighting Maharana Pratap personally. His troops were led by Maharaja Man Singh. So where are we talking about Hindu-Muslim conflict? There was always an interpenetration of communities. The historians have shown story after story of temples that had been damaged in flashes of lightning being repaired by Muslim craftsmen and volunteers from the village, of Hindus going off to Muslim shrines and praying. All of this was very, very, very common in India. But the British created ossified identities, whether it was caste, whether it was religion, created monolithic identities, all the better to rule the people they were controlling and set off one identity against another. And we're still living with the consequences of that today, not least, of course, in the now seemingly perennial conflict with our partitioned neighbor. So let me conclude then by saying the history belongs to the past, but understanding it is the duty of the present. I can't blame the British for everything that's wrong in our country today, because obviously there are failures and deficiencies for which we alone are responsible. And I'm not arguing that we should today go around hating the British, because clearly no one alive in Britain today was responsible for any of these wrongs that were done by their ancestors here. And there were also good English people, during the colonial period, who did some good stuff when they could, within the limitations of a system designed to exalt them at our expense. There were people who did some humane actions as well. There is a statute of limitations on colonial wrongdoings, but there's none on human memory, especially living memory. And there are still millions of Indians alive today who remember the iniquities of the British Empire in India because they were born to people who experienced them and heard those stories. And they're now today people in their perhaps 80s or 90s, and they will move on, and that will be the end of the living memory. But while it's still there, let's acknowledge that these are real experiences. So as I said, I didn't want to argue a case for reparations. But I think the examples I've given you, and they're by no means comprehensive, there's a lot more in the book, but the example I've given you would be enough to prove to you that surely the colonial brutality, the colonial exploitation, the colonial indifference that I talked about require moral atonement. And what form should that atonement take? One thing that people have suggested is return some artifacts. Remember the famous demand for getting the Kohinoor back. Well, let me tell you, folks, the Kohinoor is no longer the Kohinoor the British stole because it's been cut down to size for Western tastes. And the Kohinoor that adorns the Queen Mother's tiara in the Tower of London is a fraction of the original size of what was called the Kohinoor, because it was a mountain of light. It's no longer very mountainous, it's a small gem. But even then, in some ways, let it sit in the blessed Tower of London, because it would be a constant reminder of the loot that colonialism was all about. So let us leave it there. But there are other things they could return to us. There are pieces of statuary that mean nothing to the British but were worshipped in our country. There are the Amravati stupas, for example, which really do belong back in India. There's so much more. I mean, example after example, one give paintings, temples, temple idols, which have been lifted and taken wholesale to Britain. Extraction. There's Tipu Sultan's sword. We've all heard about that. There's also other artifacts. One proud symbol of the colonized people's resistance to Britain is the magnificent tiger that Tipu Sultan commissioned from a French, mechanical tiger from a French artist that is shown devouring a British Tommy in a red coat. And that you have to go to the Victoria and Albert Museum in London to see it. How bloody ironic. I think they really should return it to us to be able to display what many Indians fantasized they would do to the British, as the tiger in that mechanical display does. But after all, if Nazi-era loot is being returned to its rightful owners, or so many Jewish families or their descendants are now getting everything from Purloin paintings to other assets, including homes and lands, why can't we do something similar for at least some of the colonial artifacts? When David Cameron came here as Prime Minister, he was asked this question, and he said, I'm afraid it'll have to stay put. The British, if we gave something back to you, the entire British Museum would soon be empty. The British Museum is essentially a chore bazaar, and that ultimately is why we have to understand why they don't want to do it. So what other kind of moral atonement can they do if they don't want to return what they've stolen? And what they've stolen, by the way, you actually in many cases have to pay a donation to these blessed museums. You know, imagine somebody saying to you, please pay me money to come and see what my grandfather stole from your grandfather. I mean, that's basically what they're doing to us. But anyway, we'll put that aside for a minute. What other atonement? One could well be to teach unvarnished history in British schools. I was startled to discover when I published the British edition of my book, Inglorious Empire, that you could actually get an A level in history, the highest degree for a high school student, in history without learning a line of colonial history. Just as you could read Jane Austen while being blissfully unaware that all that comfortable life was being financed by poor black slaves toiling away in the sugar plantations of the Caribbean. Similarly, you learn about the great British victories in Waterloo and so on without having a clue of who paid for this army, where these generals cut their teeth, including Wellington, by the way, cut his teeth in India, and where the money to sustain all this came from. I've quoted an account by the writer Walpole taking a carriage down a street in London in the 1790s and literally reciting the houses that had been built with, the mansions that had been built with Indian wealth. People don't know this. So why can't you teach the history? Let people know the truth. And also, let's also teach people about the experience of those who were colonized. The only museum in London, a city of museums, which has the word imperial in it, is the Imperial War Museum, which celebrates British imperial triumphs. How about creating a museum to colonialism that shows the suffering of the colonized? Will they do it? It needs to be done. That would be one form of atonement as well. Linked to that, I think, is statuary. You know, there's even a statuary to the animals. There's a big statue in England to the animals who served the war effort in the first two wars, World War I and II. There is no statue in England to the millions of Indian soldiers who went and served the British cause in European theaters of battle that had nothing to do with India or Indian interests. And it did so because the colonial army press ganged them into doing so. No statues to them, but statues even to the animals. Come on, Britain, you can do better than that, okay? Then, so schools, textbooks, museums, statues, that's one thing. But one simple thing no one seems to be talking about is how about a simple sorry? No one's ever said sorry. for the atrocities. In fact, as recently as 3 years ago, we had a British minister saying that Britain was proud of its record as being the only country in the world that had nothing to apologize for in the 20th century. My jaw dropped. The 20th century? I mean, the century of the Jallianwala Bagh massacre, the century of the Great Bengal famine, the gassing of the Iraqis in Mesopotamia, the atrocities in Palestine, the crushing of the Mau Mau rebellion in Kenya, the killing of the Malaysians during the communist uprising in the 1950s. The British have so much blood on their hands, it would be hard put to compete with them. You had to be Hitler or something to even stand a chance in a test match against British atrocities. And yet, this is what they think, because they've taught themselves this fake history. Somebody needs to tell them colonialism was not, rose-tinted garden parties, the far pavilions, dancing around the jewel and the crown. It was about exploitation, massacres, rape and loot. And that's why I think a simple apology, it's often something that people ask, oh, how would they do it, etc. At one point, I rather mischievously said, well, since everything was done in the name of the crown, send someone from the royal family to go and apologize, because no politician would have the courage to do it. Send us Meghan Markle, for God's sake. Well, now she's no longer in the royal family, so that won't work. But I mean, it's so tragic that British politicians and royalty have come and gone and never apologized. But the poor old Anglican Archbishop of Canterbury came and prostrated himself at Jallianwala Bagh to say sorry and atone. But, it's not a man of the cloth we need. It's a man of power or a woman of power, somebody either standing for the crown or the British government in whose name all of those horrible things were done. I was always struck by the fact that when Willy Brandt was Chancellor of Germany, he sank to his knees at the Warsaw Ghetto in 1970 to apologize to Polish Jews for the Holocaust. Remember, there were hardly any Jews left in Poland by then. And Brandt, who as a socialist had himself been imprisoned by the Nazis and was completely innocent of the crimes of which he was apologizing, he was doing that gesture, going on his knees, because he was recognizing the moral responsibility of the German nation and thereby the German people whose leader he was. And that's why that kind of moral atonement would be absolutely priceless. If somebody could say, I am today leading or representing or heading a British nation that did unspeakable cruelties to all these people, and I'm coming to apologize, that would be good. By the way, I made this argument extensively in Britain when I launched my book, and I was told by the then High Commissioner in Delhi, who was a friend, listen, Shashi, you're never going to get this done, because if we apologize to you, we'll be apologizing to 130 countries. And I turned around and said, look, that's not strictly speaking true. Because if you go to a place like Singapore, which is more or less a barren rock, and build it up from scratch using Indian slave labor, amongst other things, what do you have to apologize for, except to the Indian slave labor? But they're also leading comfortable lives, or their descendants are, in Singapore. You don't have to apologize to them. You apologize to a flourishing civilization you destroyed, and there are half a dozen of those, perhaps. You don't have to worry about 130. But there is a history you need to apologize for. Anyway, we parted as friends, but a little later, about 6 months later, he called me and said, you'd be astonished to know that your proposal is actually receiving attention in the highest levels. I said, I beg your pardon. He said, there is a cabinet note moving, because I had said that the best time to do this would be the centenary of the Jallianwala Bagh massacre, which is coming up on the 13th of April, 2019. 1919 is when it happened. So suddenly, things were moving. And he said, look, watch out for a statement from the Prime Minister in the House of Parliament on that date. It happened to be a Parliament day. I remember going there with some excitement. And sure enough, when I came out, there's a jammer in Parliament, so I couldn't follow the news. I came out, and the press immediately said, have you heard the Prime Minister's statement? And I thought, my God, maybe she's apologized. It was Theresa May. No, she hadn't apologized. She had expressed regret for the events of that day. I mean, come on. Yeah, you can regret an asteroid striking the planet. You take no responsibility for it. That's not the equivalent of saying sorry, is it? But that's all she said. So an act of genuine contrition, ideally at Jallianwala Bagh, but that particular moment has been missed, and a determination in Britain to learn the lessons of empire, to teach British children what built their homeland. And I'm sorry about the parallel, but it's the equivalent would be what Germans are doing now to ship their school children to concentration camps, to show them what their ancestors did, or their forefathers did in their name, I'm afraid until the British find a way of doing that, the past will remain unatoned for, and therefore, I'm afraid, the future will always be incomplete as we move forward. Thank you very much, and sorry I took longer than planned.